So I teach and I research short stories. That's actually been one of the main focuses of my work, and they are summoned in my work a great deal. So the professor of the short story is not really a thing that exists in the world, because the obvious joke would be that would be a person who's paid to read very little, but that is in a way what I am. And I find the form to be, in some senses, interesting for the fact that it is defined both by an excess of attention and a lack of it in the critical record. By which I mean that the short story criticism, the history of short story criticism, is often highly overdetermined. But there also remains a kind of comparative paucity of criticism of the short story relative to other forms of prose narrative, especially the novel. It's not regarded as a central form in some ways. This has often led me to think about whether it's a form we do not pay sufficient attention to as an object in itself, tending to see it as a kind of offshoot of other forms. And the early styles of theorization around the short story very often use other literary forms, theatre, poetry, the novel, as the way of kind of categorizing it, as a sort of side interest. I was recently editing the Cambridge Companion to the American short story, and I came to consider the form, as I was reading the essays that were coming in, as something with a very specific charisma problem. It doesn't sell well in the current marketplace, at least not relative to the novel. Yet, with the rise of creative writing departments, it has become the key form in training and career development of writers, so central to the academy in some way. A short story is the form you pay attention to if you want to learn the skill of writing prose narrative, but it's not one anyone especially wants to read. And certainly not devote a career to, in most cases. And I'm slightly biased here in regard of an archive of American and British literature. It's very hard to build a career on the short story alone. You're sort of expected to move towards the novel as some form of seriousness in some ways. There's an imbalance of attention in its record. People don't pay attention to it, or they pay a very great deal of attention to it, perhaps too much, but it does not reward that attention in some fundamental way, either economic or emotional. When I teach short form, which as I say I regularly do, I find that students, this happened to me the other day actually, note that the short story requires a focus of reading, that it has a deep symbolic and analytical weight sentence to sentence, and this is perhaps because of its brevity in some ways. But they don't feel often rewarded by it, in the sense of it giving a sufficient sense of sympathy or connectivity with the characters. It can kind of be effectively quite cold. It's a branch of writing that is seen by many as too philosophical, but not necessarily ponderous in that way. And still more, and this ties in with another area of my research, which is the topic of intelligence, it is a smart form, and in its smartness seems highly unlikable. The irony is also that the short story, by virtue of its abridged length, is a remarkably needy literary form. It's long been established that the beginnings and endings are central to its work, such that it calls to us from the opening and remains rather consistent and relentless in its call. There's very little space in it. Partly because of its neglect as a major literary form, relative to its competitors, it's often shaped by an intensity of incident and that simultaneously gives it the impression of temporariness, but also of moral weight, the oscillation between those two things. It's very sort of immediate in some ways, but relentless and in another. And that upsets readers. They seem like contradictions, but they aren't if we see the form as especially interested in moments of emergency and crisis, which it accounts for in the archive. This was my supposition, and I really wanted to sort of test it against a large corpus. So a couple of weeks ago, I went to Stanford to pose these questions to the Lit Lab there. I don't know if people know what the Lit Lab is. It is perhaps one of the premier computational literary studies centers They take a large corpus of literature and they see how things kind of line up against one another if you take certain kinds of narrative techniques across large bodies. It's a digitized project. In an article I had commissioned for them for the Cambridge Companion, the authors noted that when analysed as a large data set from across 200 years or so of digitized short narratives and compared to the novel, quote, "The similarity between beginnings and endings in short stories is significantly higher than it is in novels. The language of short stories evidences a consistency, a unity that novels do not share. And this consistency seems to be part of the reason why it is unlikable. It doesn't seem to offer space or inattention. It's overly attentive and overly focused and draining to a reader. It has a focus and intensity that separates it from long-form narratives. It's making a very specific kind of call on our attention. And I'm reminded of something George Saunders, the American short story writer, said fairly recently in an email. I'm back to writing short stories. I hate writing short stories. They simply take too long. There's too much work in them. The other point to note is that the short story is arguably perhaps the only prose form defined primarily by its length. You might have subgenres of poetry, like the haiku and any other kind of subform of poetry where length is a feature, but the shortness of the short story is a feature of it as kind of fundamental element of what we define it to be. So the question of how long we spend and duration is deeply crucial to it. Early criticism talked about the length of endurance as being a facet of how the short story defines itself. How long can we sustain levels of attention and intensity? In the philosophy of composition, Edgar Allan Poe, who's one of the kind of first major theorists of the short story in some ways, said that it is defined by a distinct limit as regard to length, the limit of a single sitting. Poe brought the body and its physical limits into his understanding of the literary genre. The implication being that the brain and the buttocks have their limits of attention, and the short story is a mode where those limits, at least in terms of literary narrative, are kind of tested out. It doesn't want you to leave. It is intense. It is smart and oversaturated in some way with its references and symbolism. And this is another thing the Lit Lab showed. It's really relentless in its symbolic language and intensity. And it's needy. Elsewhere, Poe noted that the ordinary novel is objectionable for its length, for reasons already stated. It cannot be read in one sitting. It deprives itself, of course, of the immense force derivable from totality. Poe was arguing that the kind of special condition of the short story is its kind of condition of totality, and the novel doesn't do that. So, in essence, what I'm trying to argue is that we don't know what stories, because we don't know the amount of attention it needs, and we don't know whether or not we can offer it. This is an irony, because in some senses, the brevity might make it the perfect form for an attention-deprived world, but the market and literary criticism is not bearing that out. So what is it about the affective state of the short story as a form that rebuffs us, that challenges us? How does it lack charisma to us, even if it might be the most central and important form of attention as embodied in literary narrative? So I want to just leave it there. Thank you.